for unanimous consent to end the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of the nomination of Judge Samuel A. Alito to be an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I am supporting Judge Alito's nomination because he's, number one, superbly qualified to sit on the Supreme Court, and number two, and just as importantly, he possesses the right view of the role of a judge, the right judicial philosophy, which I think is essential in terms of taking a seat on that high court. Mr. President, the Appointments Clause, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the Constitution gives the President the plenary power to nominate certain high-level officials and, just as importantly, bestows on the U.S. Senate a crucial role, a crucial constitutional role of advice and consent. And like I hope every member of this body, I take that constitutional duty of advice and consent very seriously. I owe it as high as any duty to the people of Louisiana that I represent. And in line with that, I'll neither provide a rubber stamp of approval for all of President Bush's nominees, nor will I automatically disapprove any Democratic president's nominees for the Supreme Court or other federal courts. I think I've shown my seriousness of purpose in that regard in my short time in the Senate. I've studied the qualifications and legal writings of all nominees to see whether they possess a consistent and well-grounded judicial philosophy and have the right credentials and qualifications. I was very upfront about being mindful of that responsibility when Harriet Miers was nominated, and I looked very carefully at her qualifications and her judicial philosophy, and quite frankly, I expressed some real reservations about that. And that's why, after Judge Alito was nominated, I went and focused on those qualifications and that judicial philosophy just as hard. I met him personally. I watched his confirmation hearings. I read his record. And that's the process I used to reach this conclusion that, number one, he's eminently qualified in terms of credentials and background, and number two, he has the right judicial philosophy, the right view of the role of a judge in our society. Let's talk first about those basic legal qualifications. Again, Judge Alito is superbly qualified. Academic achievements and his distinguished career make that clear. He has a bachelor's degree from Princeton University, a JD from Yale Law School. After graduating from law school, Judge Alito began his career in public service as a clerk for Judge Leon Garth on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, now a colleague of his on that court. He served as an assistant U.S. attorney, assistant to the U.S. Solicitor General, deputy assistant attorney general, and U.S. attorney for the District of New Jersey. He's argued specifically before the U.S. Supreme Court 12 cases, at least 24 Court of Appeal cases. Very direct and relevant and impressive experience in terms of that sort of high-level litigation. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush nominated Judge Alito for the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and he was confirmed by unanimous consent in this body. Again, unanimous consent because of his strong credentials and clear and overwhelming qualifications. And of course, today those qualifications are even greater because he served as a judge on that circuit court for the past 15 years. After being nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court, the ABA rated Judge Alito, and it rated him, quote, well qualified. That's the highest rating possible, and I think everyone recognizes the ABA is not some conservative political group by any stretch of the imagination. If its membership has a slant, it's probably to the left. And that really is the gold standard, that gold standard of rating judicial qualifications and credentials. And again, Judge Alito received the highest rating. And then he had his confirmation hearings, and despite some very ugly questioning, quite frankly, and some smear tactics, in my opinion, he had a very impressive performance. He demonstrated clear humility an in-depth understanding of legal matters, and perhaps most impressive in terms of what he faced from the minority side, he maintained his composure to an excellent degree in a very unfortunate partisan atmosphere. As I said at the beginning, those credentials and qualifications, that legal background, is the first very, very important matter I look to. But it's not the only matter. And the second equally important matter I look to is a person's judicial philosophy. And do they understand the correct role of a judge in our society? I thought a lot about that regarding all nominees who have come before this body. I thought Judge Roberts expressed that role precisely right when he talked about being an umpire and not a pitcher or a batter. And I think Judge Alito has that same view of the appropriate role of a judge. Throughout the debate over judicial nominees, this notion of whether a nominee possesses that right judicial philosophy has been asked a lot. Some may ask what this term means and why it's important. Again, I think it is vitally important because it goes to the heart of the role of a judge and the heart of how this democracy works. I believe what it means is a commitment to the rule of law, a commitment to the Constitution as written, and a commitment not to let one's personal political views or personal political leanings and prejudices enter into any of those important decisions on the court. It requires a judge to be open-minded, to analyze the law carefully, to analyze the facts of each case based on the Constitution and the law. And it requires a judge not to do what can be very tempting, what can be very intoxicating in terms of the power a judge can hold, not to make new law based on personal opinion, not to play legislator, but to follow the law as enacted by the Congress or the state legislature. Judge Alito has demonstrated that right judicial philosophy. He's demonstrated his unwillingness to change the law to fit his personal beliefs. He stated very clearly, quote, "There is nothing that is more important for our republic than the rule of law. No person in this country, no matter how high or powerful, is above the law, and no person in this country is beneath the law," close quote. And what's vital and what's embedded in the concept of the rule of law is the application of the law as written, not judges becoming kings or legislatures and imposing their views and legislating from the bench. I believe this is the second and absolutely crucial matter we must look to in the confirmation of judges, particularly those who would be justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I have great confidence in Judge Alito's correct understanding of the role of a judge. Now, Mr. President, it's really troubled me that throughout this confirmation process, some of my colleagues and many outside interest groups, many members of the press, have really demonstrated a very different view of the role of a judge. And one way they've demonstrated that is they've treated Judge Alito more like a candidate for political office than a nominee for the highest court in our land. And they've talked about judges taking sides, being on this side versus that side, taking the side of labor versus management, taking the side of environmentalists versus business groups, taking the side of the little guy versus the big guy. And in talking in those terms, I believe many members of this body and many liberal interest groups and many members of the press have demonstrated a completely different view of the role of a judge, which is completely inappropriate in my opinion. Other than the fact that many of their characterizations of Judge Alito in these terms is false. For instance, he's decided in favor of employment discrimination plaintiffs in 22% of the cases, whereas the national average is 13%. It troubles me that the public is being led to believe that we should think of judges like legislators, that it should all be a results-oriented discussion. And again, this goes to the heart of this confirmation process. The role of the judiciary is to interpret the law and to apply it to the facts of each case. It's not to elect, if you will, legislators, politicians to go on the bench and just vote certain interests or certain political philosophies. And again, I believe Judge Alito has the correct view. The opposite view, quite frankly, has been demonstrated by some members of this body and certainly by the liberal press and liberal interest groups, but the correct view. And again, in his confirmation hearing, the judge made this very clear. He described his disagreement with keeping a scorecard of how many times a judge rules for or against a particular party. He stated, quote, "I don't think a judge should be keeping a scorecard about how many times that judge votes for one category of litigant versus another in particular types of cases. That would be wrong. We're supposed to do justice on an individual basis in the cases that come before us," close quote. Now, Mr. President, in closing, I want to touch on one other very specific type of case, because I believe Judge Alito has really been smeared in this category, and that's with regard to his very strong record and very strong experience in the area of civil rights. I've really been disappointed in this discussion that some of my Democratic colleagues have chosen to paint Judge Alito as having anything less than the stellar record on civil rights than he has. And in doing so, they don't really cite any evidence for this accusation. They think if they just keep repeating this smear, one dreamt up by far-left groups like Ralph Nee's People for the American Way and the Alliance for Justice, that if they just keep repeating the lie over and over and over, the American people will fall for it. Well, the American people are smarter than that. The American people are listening, for instance, to some distinguished people, including distinguished African Americans that Judge Alito has served with. Give you a couple of examples. The late Judge Leon Higginbotham, the first African American to serve on the federal district court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, and whom the LA Times calls, quote, "a legendary liberal and a scholar of U.S. racial history," close quote, had said of Judge Alito, quote, "Sam Alito is my favorite judge to sit with on this court. He's a wonderful judge and a terrific human being. Sam Alito is my kind of conservative. He's intellectually honest. He doesn't have an agenda. He's not an ideologue," close quote. Former Third Circuit Judge Timothy K. Lewis, again an African American, testified in support of Judge Alito. He joked that it was no coincidence he was sitting on the far left of the panel. He also said, quote, "I was then, as I am now, a committed and active Democrat. I learned in my year with Judge Alito that his approach to judging is not about personal ideology or ambition. He is not result-oriented. He is an honest judge who believes in judicial restraint and judicial deference," close quote. And Judge Lewis emphasized, quote, "If I sensed that Sam Alito during the time that I served with him or since then was hostile to civil rights as a justice of the United States Supreme Court, I absolutely would not be here today," close quote. Again, I hope that the smear tactics will end, particularly on an issue as important and sensitive as civil rights. And I'm confident that the American people are hearing from those sound voices, including African American voices who have served directly with Judge Alito. Many of them politically liberal, many of them Democrats, who say Judge Alito is fair, he's impartial, he's not results-oriented. In closing, Mr. President, that returns us to really the central factor I have focused on in this whole process. Does Judge Alito have the right view of the role of a judge? Does he have the right judicial philosophy? Is he committed to the Constitution as written, to the rule of law as it's written, not by him, but by legislatures and the Congress? Is he committed to that? And is he committed to not legislating from the bench? And I believe his record and his testimony and all of the evidence supports a firm conclusion that he is committed to that proper role of a judge. For that reason, Mr. President, I'm proud to be supporting the nomination of Judge Samuel Alito, and I'm confident he will serve as a very, very distinguished member of the United States Supreme Court. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back the balance of my time.